The wind had a way of howling through Cedar Ridge like a wounded animal. It was the kind of place where time moved slower, not because life was peaceful, but because nothing ever really changed. The same rusty pickup trucks lined the frozen streets every morning. The same Howflet diners served the same tired souls, and the same mountains loomed in the distance, cold and unforgiving. For Jack Turner, that sameness was both a comfort and a curse. He'd come back from the war 15 years ago and never really left the edge of it. His body was home, but his mind, it was still trapped somewhere in the desert where gunfire replaced birdsong, and every sunrise looked like smoke. Now, he lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge with his 12-year-old daughter, Ellie. The locals didn't see much of him. He worked odd jobs fixing fences, hauling wood, doing just enough to pay the bills most nights. He sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, staring into the trees as though expecting something to step out of them. That night, the first snowstorm of the season rolled in. The sky turned the color of wet concrete. Clouds gathered low, heavy with the promise of trouble. Jack double-checked the generator, the firewood, and the locks on the shed. Old habits, the kind soldiers never really lose. Ellie sat by the window, sketching in her notebook, her breath fogging the glass. "Looks like it's gonna be bad," she said quietly. Jack nodded, tossing another log into the fire. First storm always is. By midnight, the world outside was unrecognizable, a swirling white void. The power flickered twice, then went out completely. The cabin filled with the sound of wind tearing through the trees and the dull thud of snow slamming against the roof. Ellie shivered under her blanket. "Dad, do you hear that?" Jack paused, listening. At first, all he heard was the storm. Then faintly there it was. A sound, a whimper, probably a coyote, he said automatically. But Ellie was already on her feet, pressing her ear to the window. "No, it's different. It sounds hurt." Jack sighed, the kind of sigh that came from years of exhaustion rather than frustration. He reached for his coat, the old army one with the torn lining. "Stay here," he told her. "I'm coming." There was no arguing with Ellie when she used that tone, the quiet, steady one that reminded him of her mother. So he grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The storm hit them like a wall of needles. They trudged through the snow, following the sound, weak, desperate, and broken. The beam of the flashlight caught something moving near the edge of the old sawmill. The place had been abandoned for years, its roof sagging, its windows shattered like dead eyes. The whimper came again, louder this time. Jack pushed open the half-collapsed door, and a beam of light cut through the dark. There, curled up in a pile of sawdust and broken glass, was a dog, or what was left of one. Its fur was matted with blood and mud, one leg twisted at a sick angle. Its ribs showed beneath the skin, and its breathing was ragged, shallow. But what froze Jack wasn't the injuries, it was the eyes, wide, terrified and yet still alive with something that refused to die. "God," Ellie whispered, kneeling beside. "Who would do this?" Jack didn't answer. He'd seen this kind of cruelty before, not in animals, but in men. It was the same hollow brutality that war left behind in people who forgot how to feel. He took off his coat and wrapped the dog gently. "We can't leave it here." As he lifted the animal, a small sound escaped its throat, not a growl, not a cry, something softer, a plea. Back at the cabin, they laid the dog near the fire. Ellie fetched towels, warm water, and an old blanket. Together, they cleaned the wounds as best they could. The dog flinched but didn't resist. "She's a girl," Ellie said, noticing the swollen belly. "Dad, she's pregnant." Jack froze. The thought of another life growing inside that broken body hit him like a punch to the chest. He looked at the dog again, really looked this time, the trembling, the shallow breaths, the quiet endurance. "She's been fighting for them," he murmured. Ella's eyes shimmered in the firelight. "Can we keep her?" Jack wanted to say no. He really did. They barely had enough for themselves, and he'd built his life around one rule: never get attached to anything you might lose. But as the storm howled outside, he saw something he hadn't seen in years, a spark in his daughter's eyes. "Hope," he nodded. "We'll try." Ellie smiled for the first time that night. By dawn, the storm had passed. The cabin was cold, quiet. The dog was still alive, breathing softly beside the hearth, her head resting on Jack's old jacket. Snowlight poured through the window, turning everything silver. Jack stood there for a long while, staring at the fragile creature sleeping on his floor, broken, scarred, yet somehow still here. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. He didn't know it yet, but that night, the night of the first storm, would change everything. The storm had left the world quiet to quiet. By morning, Cedar Ridge looked like it had been erased and rewritten in white. Snow hung thick on the trees, burying everything it touched. The old sawmill stood silent in the distance, like a skeleton frozen midstream. Inside the cabin, the fire was dying down to embers. The dog, now wrapped in Jack's old army coat, slept near the hearth, breathing slow and shallow. Ellie had barely slept at all. She kept checking every few minutes, afraid the dog would stop breathing if she looked away too long. Jack sat at the table, staring into a mug of black coffee gone cold. The image of that broken animal haunted him. Whoever had done it hadn't just wanted to hurt her, they wanted her to suffer. That kind of cruelty didn't come from hunger or desperation. It came from something darker. He rubbed his eyes, stood up, and grabbed his coat. "Stay here, Elle. I'm going back to the mill." Ellie looked up, alarmed. "Why?" "It's freezing out there." "Because whoever did that might still be around," he said quietly. She bit her lip, then nodded. "Be careful." Jack stepped outside, the cold biting at his face. His boots crunched through the snow as he retraced their path from the night before. The air was sharp and thin, carrying only the sound of his own breath. As he neared the sawmill, something caught his eye. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Human. They led away from the mill toward the woods, deep impressions in the snow. Wide stride. Heavy boots. Fresh. He followed them. Halfway through the clearing, he heard a noise, the quick snap of a branch. Instinct took over. He ducked behind a pine tree, his pulse hammering. Then he saw him. A man, maybe mid-30s, wearing a torn jacket and a black beanie, moving fast through the trees. His right hand was bandaged, and red stains dotted the snow behind him. "Hey!" Jack's voice cut through the cold. "Stop!" The man froze, glanced back and bolted. Jack ran after him, his boots slipping, lungs burning. Years of military training came back like muscle memory, but his body wasn't what it used to be. The man was fast, desperate. They broke through a clearing. The stranger stumbled, dropping something. A dark rectangle skidded across the snow, a cell phone. Smeared with blood, he looked back once, wild-eyed, then disappeared into the woods. Jack stopped, breathing hard. The forest swallowed the man's shape like a secret. He picked up the phone. The screen was cracked, red fingerprints dried across it. Locks. He slipped it into his pocket, eyes narrowing. When he returned home, Ellie was on the floor beside the dog, whispering softly. The animal's eyes fluttered open for a moment, weak but alert. "She's waking up," Ellie said, smiling. "I think she's gonna make it." Jack kneeled beside them. "She needs a real vet. I'll take her to Grace Holloway." Grace had been Cedar Ridge's only veterinarian for as long as Jack could remember. She was in her 40s, tough as nails, but gentle when it mattered, the kind of woman who could stitch up a horse with one hand while comforting a crying kid with the other. Jack wrapped the dog carefully in a blanket and carried her to the truck. Before he could start the engine, Ellie reached in and did something that made him pause. She took her mother's red scarf, the one that still smelled faintly of lilac, and tied it around the dog's neck. "Her name's Nova," Ellie said simply. Jack blinked. "Nova, it means new," she whispered, "like a new star. She deserves one." He didn't argue. The name fit. The drive into town was slow and silent. The snowplows hadn't come through yet, and the world looked half bare. When they reached Grace Holloway's clinic, a small wooden building near Main Street, Jack carried Nova inside. The bell above the door chimed softly. Grace looked up from a stack of paperwork and froze. "Jesus, Jack, what happened?" "Found her near the old sawmill," he said. "Someone did this to her." Grace motioned to the exam table. "Lay her down." The next half hour was a blur of metal instruments, antiseptic, and low voices. Grace worked quickly, her gloved hands steady and sure. She cleaned the wounds, stitched the gap, and checked the heartbeat. "She's lucky," Grace finally said, pulling off her gloves. "Weak, but she live. She's about 6 weeks pregnant." "You brought her in just in time," Ellie exhaled, relief flooding her face. "Can we take her home?" Grace hesitated. "She needs rest. I'll keep her for a day or two. Make sure the infection's under control." After that she looked at Jack. "She needs somewhere safe to heal." Jack nodded slowly. "We'll take a..." Grace smiled faintly. "Didn't think you were a dog person." "I'm not," Jack said. Then he looked at Ellie, who was gently petting Nova's paw. "But she is." As they turned to leave, Jack remembered the phone. He pulled it from his pocket and handed it to Grace. "We found this where we picked her up," he said. "Blood on it." Grace frowned. "You think it's connected?" "I don't think," Jack said, his voice low. "I know. Outside." The sun was setting behind the ridge, painting the snow in shades of fire and gold. Ellie tugged at his sleeve. "Do you think she'd be okay, Dad?" Jack looked back toward the clinic windows, where Nova lay under a warm lamp, the red scarf glowing softly around her neck. "She's a fighter," he said. "She'll make it." But as they drove home, his thoughts weren't on the dog, they were on the man in the woods, the bloody phone in his pocket, and the footprints that were already disappearing beneath the falling snow. Something told him this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The storm had passed, but Cedar Ridge was still frozen under a pale, gray sky. The roads were slushy with melt, and the pine trees bowed heavy with ice. Inside the clinic, the air was warm and thick with the scent of antiseptic and coffee. Grace Holloway leaned over the examination table, her brows knitted in concentration. Nova lay still beneath a soft light, her breathing steadier now. A faint tremor moved through her body every so often, but her eyes were open, alert, intelligent, and tired. Grace ran a scanner slowly along Nova's neck. Beep. The device flashed once, then went silent. Grace frowned, adjusted the settings, and scanned again. Another beep, then static. She unplugged the scanner, checked the display. The serial number was half erased, the data corrupted. Not just random corruption, deliberate tampering. Jack stood by the window, his arms crossed, watching the snow drip from the eaves. What is it? Grace exhaled. She has a microchip. Military issue, but someone wiped it. Jack turned. Military? Grace nodded slowly. Not the type you find in shelter dogs or family pets. This one's designed for federal K-9 units tracking, vitals, mission data. Whoever she belonged to, they didn't want her being traced. Jack stared at Nova, his mind turning. He'd seen plenty of dogs in the service. He remembered the way they moved, sharp, trained, almost human in their discipline. Nova had that same quiet alertness, even in her pain. She's not just some stray, Grace said softly. No, Jack murmured. She isn't. Grace turned back to her microscope, adjusting the focus. There's more. Jack moved closer. What do you mean? I ran a blood panel earlier. Something's off. Her liver enzymes are through the roof, and there are traces of a compound I've never seen before. It looks like polymer residue. Jack frowned. English, Doc. Grace looked up at him. She's been injected with something synthetic, not medical grade. My guess, someone used her to transport something they didn't want found. Jack's jaw tightened. Drugs. Grace hesitated. Or worse, some of those new compounds they're used for smuggling high-density narcotics. Even biochematerial, they use the dogs as living containers. He felt a cold rush down his spine. He looked at Nova again, her side rising and falling gently, her muzzle twitching in sleep. He thought about the chains, the blood, the fear in her eyes when he found her. Jesus. Grace nodded. Whoever did this, they didn't just beat her, they used her. Jack turned away, pacing. You should send this to the authorities. Get it logged officially. I already did the blood work under a test ID, Grace said. But if this ties to any federal project, they'll bury it fast. Jack ran a hand over his face. I'll talk to Doyle. He'll know what to do. Grace gave him a long look, not one of trust, but of quiet warning. Be careful, Jack. Sometimes the people who know what to do are the ones who don't want the truth found. By the time Jack reached the station, the wind had picked up again. The building sat on the edge of town, a squat brick structure with a flagpole that hadn't seen fresh paint in years. Cedar Ridge didn't have much crime, mostly drunks, lost hikers, and the occasional bar fight. But Doyle liked to act like he was running a border operation. Jack stepped into the office. The air smelled of coffee and old paper. Doyle was there, tall, broad, with that permanent squint of a man who never stopped distrusting everyone. Jack, Doyle said, without looking up from his paperwork. You look like hell. Found something at the mill the other night. Jack set the phone down on the desk. And a dog. Beaten up bad. Doyle finally looked up. You call me out here for a dog. Not just a dog. Jack said. Grace found a wiped K-9 chip and something synthetic in her blood. She thinks she was being used to transport illegal cargo. The guy who did it dropped that phone. Doyle stared at the blood-stained device for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair. Jack, you've been out of the field too long. You see a hurt dog and start thinking conspiracy. It's not a theory, Jack said. Grace can back me up. Doyle picked up the phone, wiped a bit of dried blood with his thumb. You didn't tell anyone else, did you? Just you. Good. Doyle set it down gently. Listen, Jack, there's no need to stir this up. If that phone's tied to something bigger, it's not ours to touch. The feds hate local interference. Jack narrowed his eyes. So what do you want me to do? Pretend I didn't see it? Doyle smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Exactly. For now, stay quiet. For your own good. For Ellie's. That last line hit harder than it should have. Jack stood there for a long moment, the air thick between them. Then he nodded once curtly. Fine. When he stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a slap. The The snow had started again, light, drifting flakes that caught in his hair and melted down his collar. He walked to his truck, his boots crunching in rhythm with his thoughts. Doyle's tone. His eyes. Something didn't sit right. "Stay quiet," he'd said. Jack had heard that phrase too many times before from superiors who wanted messes buried, from commanders who didn't want to answer questions about why soldiers came home broken. He looked back at the station. The lights glowed behind frosted glass, steady and silent. In the rearview mirror, he could almost see the reflection of Nova, the dog who'd survived a kind of hell no creature deserved. If there were secrets buried under the snow, Jack Turner wasn't the kind of man to leave them there, not anymore. The nights in Cedar Ridge were the hardest, not because of the cold. Jack Turner had endured far worse in places the sun forgot to rise, but because silence had a way of unearthing everything he tried to bury. The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind. The old clock on the mantel ticked too loud. Ellie slept upstairs, her nightlight casting soft stars across the wall, and down by the hearth, Nova lay curled on a blanket, the red scarf still wrapped around her neck like a promise. Jack sat in the chair beside her, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. The firelight painted shadows across his face, the kind that made him look older than his 40 years. His eyes drifted to the window, to the white night beyond, and then to the scars running across his knuckles. War had a way of following you home, not in uniforms or gunfire, but in memories that refused to die. He could still hear it. The thunder of explosions, the smell of dust and blood, the thud of dogs barking in the dark. There'd been one, a German shepherd named Rex, who'd saved 3 men before dying in his arms, loyal to the end. Jack had buried him under a ruined wall and promised himself he'd never get close to another animal again. And yet here was Nova breathing softly, one ear twitching every time the wind shifted. Jack leaned forward and whispered, "You've got his eyes. You know that." Nova stirred, half asleep, then, as if in answer, she lifted her head and looked straight at him. It wasn't fear or confusion, it was recognition, the kind a soldier gives another across a battlefield. Jack smiled faintly. "Yeah, I see you, too." The next morning came in shades of gray and frost. Ellie was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the fire, reading out loud from one of her picture books while Nova listened or pretended to. "See, she likes stories," Ellie said proudly. Jack poured himself coffee. "You sure she's not just pretending to like you because you sneak her toast?" Ellie giggled. "She's not pretending. She understands." Jack watched them, the girl and the dog, and something in his chest loosened a little. It had been months since laughter had filled this house, since his daughter's eyes had carried light instead of loss. Grace Holloway came by around noon to check on Nova. She moved through the house like she belonged there, her coat still dusted with snow, hair pulled back, a smile that didn't quite hide her fatigue. "She's healing well," Grace said, kneeling beside Nova, "but she's still guarded. See how she keeps her front paw tucked under? That's a defensive posture." Jack nodded. "Old habits die hard." Grace glanced up. "You'd know about that." He didn't respond. She didn't push. Grace continued her examination, checking stitches, temperature, breathing. Then she did something that made both Jack and Ellie pause. She clapped her hands sharply once. Nova's ears perked, her body tensed, head snapping toward the sound. Grace took a small step to the left, then gave a soft command, a word Jack hadn't heard in years. "Stay." Nova froze, didn't move a muscle. Jack's eyes narrowed. "You trained K9s before?" Grace shook her head slowly. "No, but she's definitely been trained by someone who did. The muscle memory is still there." He crouched down, looking into Nova's eyes. "She reacts to commands like she's waiting for orders, or like she misses them," Grace said quietly. That stuck with him, like she misses them. That night, the storm returned. Not the kind that comes from the sky, the kind that comes from inside. Jack sat by the fire again after Ellie went to bed. He'd tried reading, but the words on the page blurred into memories. He saw his wife Anna standing in the doorway, smiling that small, tired smile she always had when he came home from deployment. He saw the way her hands trembled near the end, the illness stealing her piece by piece until there was nothing left but an empty bed and a folded flag. He'd built the cabin to escape the world. But grief had a way of finding the cracks. Nova stirred beside him, ears twitching again. Then, suddenly, she stood up, alert, muscles taut. She padded toward the window, growling low. Jack reached for the shotgun, leaning by the door, heart pounding. But when he looked out, nothing. Just the wind sweeping across the frozen yard. "Easy, girl," he murmured, lowering the gun. "Old ghosts." Nothing more. Nova relaxed slowly, tail lowering. She walked back to him and pressed her head gently against his leg. The simple, silent gesture cracked something inside him. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hand found the top of her head almost on instinct. "Guess we both wake up when the wind blows," he said softly. Nova looked up, her eyes glinting in the firelight, deep, steady, alive. Jack's throat tightened. "You've seen things too, haven't you?" The dog didn't move, didn't blink, just stayed there, solid and silent, like a living answer to a question he'd carried too long. When Ellie crept downstairs a few minutes later, rubbing her eyes, she saw them both by the fire, her father and Nova sitting close, two silhouettes against the glow. "Dad," she whispered, "can I sleep down here tonight?" He nodded. "Sure, kiddo." She lay beside Nova, resting her head on the dog's back. Within minutes, both were asleep. Jack watched them, his daughter, the only piece of his wife still breathing, and the wounded animal who somehow had stitched something back together in this broken house. Outside, the snow fell softly again, erasing footprints, quieting the world. Inside, for the first time in a long while, warmth lingered. Not just from the fire but from the fragile, a flickering spark of something that almost felt like hope. Snow blanketed Cedar Ridge in silence that morning, the kind that muffled every sound and made the whole world hold its breath. Jack Turner stood by the frosted window, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hand. The sky was pale and bruised with dawn. In the living room, by the fireplace, Nova was restless. Her breathing came in short, shallow bursts. Ellie knelt beside her, whispering softly, her small hand stroking Nova's head. "She's shaking, Daddy," Ellie said, eyes wide with worry. "Is she gonna be okay?" Jack set his mug down and crouched beside them. He could see it now, Nova's body tensing, her paws twitching. It wasn't fear this time, it was labor. "She's strong," he said quietly, "just like her mom." Grace arrived within the hour, her truck skidding slightly on the icy road. She came through the door with her vet kit and that calm steadiness Jack had come to notice more and more. Within minutes, the house turned into a small maternity ward. Ellie fetched towels, Jack boiled water. Grace guided Nova through the storm inside her body. By noon, for small, squirming lives had entered the world, tiny bodies blind and trembling, their fur slick and warm. Ellie's laughter filled the cabin as she counted each one, wrapping them gently in old blankets. "4 of them," she said with delight. "2 boys and 2 girls. Can we name them, Daddy?" Jack smiled. "The first real one in a while. Let's wait until they open their eyes," he said. "They'll tell us who they are." Grace chuckled, wiping her hands. "That's more poetic than I expected from a man who used to shout orders in a war zone." Jack shrugged, but there was warmth in his eyes. "Guess I'm out of practice." For the first time in years, the little cabin didn't feel haunted, it felt alive. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and milk, the soft whimpers of new life, and Ellie's humming. Grace stayed longer than she needed to, helping Nova nurse the pups, her hands moving gently but confidently. Jack found himself watching her, the way her hair caught the firelight, the calm way she spoke to Ellie, the quiet smile she gave Nova after each puppy latched on. It stirred something in him he thought had died long ago, the feeling that home wasn't just a place, it was people. Over the next few weeks, Grace came by often, bringing medicine, food, or just excuses to check in. She and Ellie baked cookies. Sometimes she'd stay for dinner, and laughter light and unforced would echo through the house. Jack, who had grown used to silence, found himself waiting for those evenings. One night, as the snow fell thick outside, Jack and Grace sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the world fade to white. The smell of pine and smoke lingered in the cold. "She's lucky, you know," Grace said softly. "Nova, most dogs like her don't get second chances." Jack nodded, eyes on the horizon. "None of us do, but maybe we can make the first one count this time." Grace turned to him, studying his face, the scars, the lines, the quiet exhaustion. "You think you deserve that, Jack, a second chance?" He didn't answer right away. The wind howled faintly through the trees. Inside, Ellie was asleep beside Nova and her pups. "I think," he said finally, "we all do, if we're brave enough to take it." A few days later, that fragile peace was tested. Ellie was playing out back when a howl split the air. Low, hungry, and too close. Jack rushed out, shotgun in hand. A gray blur moved through the snow, eyes glowing like embers. A lone wolf, thin from hunger, it crept toward Ellie, who froze in fear. Before Jack could fire, Nova lunged. She tore through the snow like a storm unleashed. Facing herself between the wolf and Ellie, the two animals collided, growling, snapping a flash of teeth in fury. Jack shouted her name, but Nova didn't stop. In the chaos, the wolf bit deep into Nova's shoulder, but she held her ground, driving it back until it limped into the woods. Blood stained the snow. Jack dropped the gun and ran to her, Easy, girl, he whispered, his voice breaking. You did good, you did real good. Grace arrived minutes later, summoned by Ellie's frantic call. She stitched Nova's wound in the kitchen while Jack held her steady, whispering words he hadn't used since his days on the battlefield, words meant to calm a comrade under fire. When it was over, Grace looked up at him. She'll make it, she said, her voice soft but sure. Jack exhaled, shoulders slumping. She saved my daughter, he murmured, didn't even think twice. Grace gave a faint smile. That's what loyalty looks like. Jack stared at Nova, lying there weak but alive, and felt something shift inside him. He remembered men who'd thrown themselves on grenades, who'd stayed behind so others could live. He thought he'd buried that kind of courage with them, but here it was again, breathing on his kitchen floor. Later that night, after Grace had gone, Jack sat beside Nova by the fire. Ellie slept nearby, her head resting on his knee. He reached out and laid a hand on Nova's side, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of her heart. Guess we're both still learning how to protect what matters, he whispered. Outside, the wind howled across the ridges. But inside, under that small roof, there was warmth, the kind that doesn't come from firewood, but from the fragile, fierce love of those who refuse to give up on each other. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold had only sharpened. Jack Turner sat alone at his kitchen table, the fire behind him burning low. In front of him lay the phone, the same one that had fallen from the stranger's hand that night in the sawmill. Its cracked screen glowed faintly, like an eye that refused to close. He'd charged it using an old army cable, and now it buzzed quietly with life. The passcode had taken hours to bypass. The skills he'd buried with his past were resurfacing, one by one, when the home screen finally appeared. Jack felt a familiar chill, the kind that used to run through him before every mission. He scrolled through the contacts first. Most were blank, replaced with encrypted strings of numbers, but one name stood out. Jake Milner. Jack clicked it open. There were text messages, hundreds of them, filled with coordinates, payment logs, and fort-coded exchanges. But one message stopped him cold. Shipment confirmed. Rock wants the dog alive. Don't lose the asset again. The timestamp matched the night Nova was found. Jack leaned back, rubbing a hand across his jaw. He didn't know the name Rock, but something about it crawled under his skin. He copied the messages onto a flash drive, then called Grace. She answered on the second ring. Jack, it's late. Everything okay? I need you to take a look at something, he said. It's about Nova. Within the hour, Grace was at his cabin. She brushed the snow from her coat, her face half hidden by a scarf. Jack plugged the flash drive into his laptop, projecting the data onto the wall. Lines of messages filled the screen, cold, efficient, and unmistakably military in tone. Grace's eyes narrowed as she read. Jake Milner, she murmured. That name's come up before. He used to work under a man named Silas Rock. Jack turned to her. You know him? She hesitated, only by reputation. Rock ran a logistics front out west a few years back. But under the surface it was more than that. Illegal biotech, black market animal trials, smuggling. The government shut it down after a scandal involving experimental canine units. Jack frowned. Experimental canine units. Grace nodded. They called it Project Helix. It was supposed to create combat dogs that could track targets through biochemical markers. But there were side effects, aggression, neural decay. The project was dissolved. Officially, all the animals were destroyed. Jack looked toward the fireplace, where Nova lay sleeping beside her pups. Guess one survived. Grace sighed. If Rock's name is showing up again, it means he's still moving something, and Nova was part of it. Jack finished quietly. They stood in silence. The only sound, the crackle of burning wood. Grace finally broke it. Jack, this isn't something you can handle alone. If Rock's back in play, he's not just some smuggler. He's dangerous. Jack stared at the phone again. So am I. Grace stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. You've already done your time fighting ghosts. Don't start another war. Jack gave a dry laugh. The problem is, Grace, sometimes the war finds you first. That night, after Grace left, Jack couldn't sleep. The snow outside glowed under a ghostly moonlight, and every creak of the cabin felt like a whisper from his past. He opened the laptop again, following the coordinates from the messages. They mapped a route through the old rail lines north of Cedar Ridge, abandoned freight tunnels once used during the war. Jack's pulse quickened. He knew those tunnels. He'd helped secure them years ago. If Rock's men were using them again, it meant one thing. Something was being moved beneath Cedar Ridge. He thought of Nova, of the scar across her flank, the microchip Grace had found, the strange, restless way she sometimes stared into the distance like she remembered orders she could no longer follow. He grabbed his coat, loaded his rifle, and slipped out into the night. The forest was still and silver under the moon. Jack's boots crunched softly in the snow as he followed the trail down toward the valley. He reached the old rail yard before dawn. The wooden sign still hung crookedly. Ridge Freight closed since 1989. Jack crouched behind a rusted container. Through his binoculars, he saw movement to men unloading crates from a black van, their breath fogged in the cold, their movements precise, rehearsed. One of them turned slightly, and Jack saw his face. Jake Milner, the man from the phone, the one who'd run into the woods that night. Jack watched him bark orders, his voice echoing through the valley. Something inside Jack shifted. The soldier in him, the part that understood danger not as fear but as geometry and timing, came alive again. He waited until they left, then crept closer. The crates were labeled Agrotech Medical Supply, but the seals had military coating. He pried one open. Inside, wrapped in insulation, were vials each marked with the same symbol Grace had shown him from the Helix program files. Jack's hand tightened. "So that's your game, Rourke," he muttered. "You're still building weapons." A low growl sounded behind him. He turned. Nova had followed. Her ears were back, her stance alert. Jack placed a hand on her neck. "Easy, girl. We're going home." But as he turned to leave, headlights fled in the distance. Another vehicle was approaching. Jack and Nova slipped into the shadows, his breath clouding in the frozen air. He watched as a man stepped out of the truck tour, wearing a black coat, his presence commanding even in silence. Silas Rock. The man looked around the yard, his eyes sharp and calculating. Then, almost as if he could feel the stare from the darkness, he turned directly toward Jack's hiding spot. For a heartbeat, the two men locked eyes through the falling snow, one a ghost of war, the other a monster born from it. And in that single moment, Jack Turner knew this wasn't just about Nova anymore. It was about everything that was taken, everything that was buried in the name of security and silence. As Rourke turned away and the trucks began to roll, Jack whispered to Nova, "Looks like the war's back, girl. Let's finish what they started." And with that, he disappeared into the woods, the darkness closing behind them like a curtain before the next act. The night came down heavy over Cedar Ridge, thick, silent, and sharp as broken glass. Snow clung to the windows of Jack Turner's cabin, muting every sound except the faint ticking of the stove. Inside, the fire burned low, throwing long shadows across the wooden walls. Nova lay near the door, her head resting on her paws, ears twitching now and then. Her pup slept in a heap beside the fireplace, the soft rhythm of their breathing the only sign of peace left in that house. Jack sat in the armchair, the weight of what he'd discovered earlier that week pressing hard against his chest. He hadn't told Grace or Ellie about a rogue being alive, or the crates in the rail yard, or how close danger had crept. Some truths, he thought, needed to be carried alone. Outside, the wind shifted, the trees groaned, Nova's ears perked. Jack noticed it to a subtle change in the sound of the night. Not the wind, something slower. Footsteps? He reached for his pistol on the table and clicked off the lamp. The cabin fell into darkness. For a moment there was silence. Then, a faint creak from the porch boards. Jack stood slowly, gun raised. Nova was already up, tail stiff, her growl a low, trembling rumble. The doorknob turned. The door cracked open. A shape slipped through tall, wrapped in black, breath hissing through clenched teeth. A knife glinted in his hand. The man didn't see Nova until it was too late. She lunged from the shadows with a snarl that tore through the quiet like thunder. The intruder stumbled back, his knife flashing as he tried to strike. Nova clamped her jaws on his arm, shaking with a ferocity Jack hadn't seen since the war. "Nova, done!" Jack shouted, rushing forward. The man kicked her off and swung the knife toward Jack. He fired a warning shot that splintered the doorframe inches from the man's head. The intruder froze, panting, blood dripping from his sleeve where Nova's teeth had torn through. "Drop it," Jack said, his voice calm, steady. Now, the knife clattered to the floor. Jack flicked the light back on, revealing the man's face. Recognition hit instantly. Jake Milner, the same man from the sawmill, the one who'd run. "Well, look who crawled back out of hell," Jack muttered. Milner's eyes burned with hate. "You shouldn't have gotten involved." "Turner," Jack pressed the barrel of the gun against his chest. "You broke into my home, tried to kill my dog. I'm involved, whether I like it or not." Milner smirked through the pain. "You think you know what you're dealing with. You don't. Rourke owns this town. Every badge, every report. You're just a ghost in the wrong story." Jack hit him once, hard enough to knock him into a chair. "Start talking. What's Rock moving through those tunnels? And what was Nova to him?" Milner laughed bitterly, blood staining his teeth. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me. The fire popped. Outside, the storm howled again. Inside, the silence tightened like a noose. Milner's grin faltered. He's not smuggling drugs anymore. He's moving people, test subjects. One of them's a federal agent Keene. He got too close to Rock's operation, so they made him disappear. Jack's got twisted. Keene, you mean Agent Marcus Keene, Homeland Security? Milner nodded. Yeah, he's alive, but barely. They're keeping him somewhere out past Pine Ridge. Rock wants him as leverage. Jack exchanged a glance with Nova, who sat beside him now, her chest rising and falling fast. And Doyle? Jack asked quietly. What's his role in this? Milner hesitated, then gave a crooked smile. The good sheriff. He's been taking Rock's money for years. Makes sure reports vanish, keeps people quiet. He even signed off the order that buried Project Helix. Rock couldn't have done any of this without him. Jack's jaw tightened. The betrayal stung deeper than he expected. He'd served under men like Doyle before, men who wore loyalty like a costume. Why tell me this? He asked. Milner shrugged, wincing from his wound. Because Rock doesn't forgive failure. He sent me to finish the job, to kill the dog, burn your house, clean the mess. But he nodded toward Nova. She fights like one of us. And me. I'm tired of dying for someone else's secret. Jack holstered his gun and grabbed a roll of duct tape from a drawer. You're going to show me where they're keeping him. Milner's eyes flickered. You're insane. You go after Rolk, you'll never make it back. Jack tied his wrists and pushed him into a corner. I've been told that before. Nova patted over, nose twitching. Still on edge, Jack knelt beside her, his hand brushing the scar on her flank. You did good, girl, he whispered. Real good. As he stood, Ellie appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing her eyes. Dad, what's going on? Jack froze for a moment, then softened his tone. Go back to bed, sweetheart. Everything's okay. Her gaze drifted to Milner, bloodied, tied, eyes full of venom. Is that the bad man? She asked quietly. Jack nodded. Yeah, but he's not going to hurt anyone anymore. Ellie looked at Nova and smiled faintly. Good girl, she whispered before retreating upstairs. When her door closed, Jack turned back to Milner. You're going to take me to Pine Ridge tomorrow. You'll walk me right through Rock's operation. You try anything, and I'll let her finish what she started. Milner gave a cold, resigned laugh. You really think one man and a dog can take him down? Jack looked toward the window where the snow was falling harder now. The world outside swallowed by white silence. I've seen smaller arts, he said. And I've seen what happens when good men do nothing. He walked to the fire, stoked it once more, and let the warmth fill the cabin. Nova settled beside the door again, eyes trained on Milner like a sentry, in the flicker of the flames. Jack could almost see it, his next mission forming out of the dark. Not a war fought for orders or flags this time, but for truth, for his daughter, for the broken creature that had chosen to trust him. And somewhere out there, in a frozen warehouse beyond Pine Ridge, another man waited, an agent bound and forgotten, holding the final piece of a secret that could burn the whole town to the ground. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, the decision had already been made. Tomorrow, the hunt would begin. Morning came gray and heavy over Cedar Ridge. The air was thick with the smell of snow, the kind that promised another blizzard before nightfall. Jack Turner stood at the window of his cabin, coffee untouched in his hand, eyes locked on the dark horizon where the mountains met the clouds. He knew what was coming, both the storm and what lay waiting beyond it. Behind him, Jake Milner sat bound to a chair, sullen and bruised, his breath fogging in the cold. Grace Holloway moved quietly around the kitchen, checking the bandage on his arm. She wasn't gentle about it. Still bleeding, she said. Milner winced. You're not exactly a soft touch, Doc. You're lucky to still have an arm, Grace replied flatly. Jack turned from the window. He's not lucky. He's useful for now. He laid out a map on the table, tracing a path with his finger. These coordinates he gave line up with the Pine Ridge tunnels. The old supply line runs straight under them. That's where they keeping Agent Keene. Grace leaned closer, scanning the map. If Doyle's protecting rope, you can't just walk in there. Every road, every checkpoint, they'll be waiting. Jack exhaled slowly. I don't plan on walking. He flipped the map, revealing a network of faded military notations. There's an old ranger trail cutting through the North Woods. Not on any modern chart. I can use it to flank the ridge and get into the tunnels from below. No one will see me coming. Miller laughed under his breath. You're out of your mind. Those tunnels are rigged tighter than a minefield. Jack met his gaze coldly. Then you'll make sure I don't step on the wrong wire. Grace crossed her arms. Jack, listen to yourself. You're talking about marching into a fortified smuggling base with one hostage and a wounded conscience as your guide. Jack's voice hardened. There's a man in there who doesn't deserve to die in the dark, and a monster running free because men like Doyle are too afraid or too comfortable to stop him. Grace's expression softened. She'd seen that look before, in veterans who hadn't yet learned how to come home. And what about Ellie? She asked quietly. Jack hesitated. The question landed like a blade. She'll be safe, he said finally. You'll stay here with her until I'm back. Grace shook her head. You think she won't notice? You think she hasn't already? Upstairs, Ellie stood in the hallway, clutching the railing. She'd been awake since dawn, listening. Every word cut through her like the cold. She knew that tone in her father's voice, the same one he'd used the day he said goodbye before his last deployment, the one that meant he wasn't sure he'd come back. Downstairs, Grace knelt by the table, bowing her head. Jack, she said softly, there are battles we fight with our hands and others we can only fight with faith. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. Wary faith doesn't stop bullets. No, Grace said, looking up at him, but it stops you from becoming one. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire popped softly, and the wind whistled outside the cracks of the old cabin. Finally, Jack sighed. If I don't do this, no one will. Grace reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Then let me pray for you before you go. He didn't argue. For a man who had seen death too many times, there was something grounding in hearing someone whisper his name before God. As Grace prayed, Ellie crept back into her room, heart pounding. She sat on the floor, clutching the red scarf her mother had left her. Nova, lying beside the bed, lifted her head and nudged the girl's arm with her nose. Ellie whispered, they're not telling us everything, Nova. I can feel it. The dog's brown eyes seemed to understand. When Grace and Jack went outside to prepare the truck, Ellie tiptoed down the stairs. Milner was still tied to the chair, dozing. His coat hung on the back of another chair. Something inside it blinked faintly, a green light. Ellie's curiosity sparked. She reached in and pulled out a small GPS tracker. On its screen glowed a red dot. Moving slowly across a digital map, she tapped the screen. The coordinates matched what her father had been talking about, Pine Ridge. She stared at the device, her breath catching. They're keeping someone there. She looked toward the door, where snow drifted through the cracks. And then to Nova. We could find him first, she whispered, before Dad gets hurt. Nova's tail twitched. Ellie grabbed her mother's scarf from the table and looped it around her neck. She slipped on her boots and coats, stuffed the GPS into her pocket, and opened the back door. The wind hit her like ice. Come on, girl, she whispered. Nova trotted after her without hesitation, stopping only once to look back at the house before following Ellie into the woods. By the time Jack came back inside, the room was silent. He walked to the living room, calling, Ellie, you ready for breakfast? No answer. He checked her room, empty. The bed still warm, the window slightly ajar. Then he saw the faint outline of small footprints in the snow outside. 2 sets. One human, one canine. His heart dropped. No, he whispered. Grace appeared in the doorway, face pale. Jack, what is it? He pointed to the open window, his voice breaking into a growl. She's gone. She took Nova. Milner lifted his head from the chair, a cruel smile spreading across his bruised face. Guess the kid's got more guts than you thought. Jack lunged at him, slamming him back against the wall. Where would she go? Milner choked out a laugh. Same place you're headed, Pine Ridge. Grace covered her mouth, trembling. Jack, the storm's coming back. You can't. But he was already grabbing his rifle, throwing on his coat. His voice was low, steady, deadly. I have to. He glanced once at the map on the table, the route, the tunnels, the truth, then at Grace. Keep the fire burning. If we're not back by dawn. She shook her head, eyes wet. Don't you dare finish that sentence. Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't. Outside, the first flakes were already falling again, swirling like ghosts across the valley. Somewhere ahead, his daughter and the dog who'd saved them both were walking straight into the heart of the storm. And as Jack Turner stepped into the snow, the wind rose with a howl, carrying with it the sound of war returning to Cedar Ridge. The snow started as a whisper against the windows of Cedar Ridge, a faint rustle that grew into the furious roar of winter. By dawn, the town was buried in white, every roof heavy, every tree bent under the storm's weight. But Ellie Turner wasn't in town anymore. She was deep in Pine Ridge Forest, with only the beam of a small flashlight and the loyal shadow of Nova beside her. Her boots sank ankle-deep in the snow with each step. The forest howled around them, wind threading through the pines like a living thing. Ellie's breath came out in small clouds, her scarf frozen stiff against her lips. She clutched the GPS tracker she'd taken from Milena's jacket, a blinking green dot on a cracked screen that pulsed like a heartbeat. This way, girl. she whispered, her voice trembling as much from cold as fear. Nova pressed close to her leg, her golden fur dusted with frost. She was leaner now, stronger after weeks of recovery. The scar across her flank had healed, but in the icy dark, Ellie could see the faint glint of it when lightning flared overhead. Nova didn't seem to mind the storm. Her ears were up, her nose twitching, constantly alert. Searching, Ellie stumbled once, falling to her knees in the snow. Nova turned immediately, nudging her arm, whining softly. "I'm okay," Elle murmured, though her fingers were numb, and her tears stung like ice. "We just have to find him. We just have to help." Back home, Jack and Grace were probably panicking by now. Jack's truck would be buried, the roads impassable. Ellie knew that if she'd told them what she'd planned, they'd have locked the door and never let her leave. But she couldn't wait. Not when there was someone out there, a man captured, maybe dying, and her father too broken by the past to act fast enough. Snow lashed her face, sharp and blinding. She pulled her hood tighter and pressed on. After nearly an hour of trudging, they reached a ridge overlooking a clearing. Down below, half buried under the storm, it stood an old lumber warehouse, the kind used decades ago before Cedar Ridge's mill shut down. A faint light flickered in one of the windows. Smoke curled from a metal chimney, dark against the white. Ellie's heart leapt. "That's it, Nova. That's where they're keeping him." Nova's ears perked up, tails stiff. A low growl rumbled from her chest. Ellie whispered, crouching behind a fallen tree. She could make out figures moving inside through the frosted glass, silhouettes pacing, shadows thrown by a single hanging bulb. The storm masked most sounds, but now and then she thought she heard shouting, maybe even a metallic clang. Her hand fumbled in her pocket and found her mother's flashlight, the one with the red beam Jack had fixed last year. She hesitated, glancing at the horizon. The world was a sheet of white chaos. There was no way anyone could find her out here unless she made them. "Okay," she breathed, her lips turning blue. "We'll send a signal." She clicked the switch 3 times, long short, just like her dad had taught her when they learned Morse code together. SOS. The light blinked through the snow, faint, desperate, but constant. Nova stood guard beside her, head low, muscles tense. Inside the warehouse, movement stopped. One of the figures turned toward the window. For a second, Ellie's stomach dropped. Had they seen her? Suddenly, a door slammed open. A man stepped out, bundled in a thick coat, a flashlight cutting through the storm. "Someone's out there," she heard him yell. "By the ridge." Nova growled, teeth bared. "Run, girl," Ellie whispered, grabbing her backpack and darting along the edge of the clearing. But the snow betrayed her. Each step left a clear trail. Voices shouted behind her. 2 flashlights split the dark, beams sweeping across the trees. Nova bolted ahead, circling back once to bark sharply, a warning. Ellie followed her, heart hammering, lungs burning. She couldn't think, couldn't feel her hands anymore, just move. A gunshot cracked through the storm. The sound echoed off the frozen hills. Ellie screamed. "Nova." The dog didn't falter. She darted behind a cluster of rocks, motioning almost like a soldier. Ellie crawled after her, clutching the flashlight to her chest. The beam wobbled, then hit something metallic half buried in snow. A hatch. Together they cleared the snow away, revealing a rusted trapdoor leading down. Nova sniffed wind and looked up at Ellie. "Go," Ellie urged, prying it open with her frozen fingers. The hinges screamed, but the storm swallowed the sound. They slipped inside just as another flashlight swept past above them. The air below was warmer, heavy with the smell of oil and iron. A narrow staircase led into a storage room, dim, lined with old crates. Ellie coughed, covering her mouth, her flashlight beam trembling over a stack of metal cages. One of them moved. "Hello," she whispered. A man's voice, weak, hoarse, answered from the shadows. "Who's there?" Ellie's pulse spiked. "Agent Keene." A pause. Then, How did you find this place?" "Nova helped me," Ellie said, stepping closer. "We came to get you out." The man tried to stand, but the chains around his wrists rattled. Nova crept forward, sniffed him once, and wagged her tail, a quiet, knowing gesture above them. Footsteps pounded. Someone had found the hatch. Ellie swallowed hard. "They're coming." Keene looked at her with disbelief and urgency. "Then we don't have much time." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the walls. Inside, a child, a soldier, and a dog stood in the dim light, bound together by courage, faith, and the fragile hope that somewhere out there, help was on its way. And miles away, Jack Turner's truck roared to life. He'd seen the faint red blinks in the storm. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, as his daughter was out there, and this time he wasn't going to lose her. The road to Pine Ridge was buried in white. Wind howled through the mountains, a living wall of ice and rage. Jack Turner's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned pale. The wipers fought against sheets of snow, but he could barely see the road ahead. Grace sat beside him, her face lit by the dashboard glow, pale, focused, praying silently under her breath. "Ellie's out there," Jack muttered, voice low and breaking. "She's out there with them." Grace placed a trembling hand on his arm. "Then we find her," she said, "and we bring her home." The truck roared through the storm like a beast, headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the blizzard, and then, faintly through the white chaos, a flicker of light in the distance. The old lumber warehouse. Smoke rose from the chimney, black against the swirling snow. Jack hit the brakes. That's it. They stepped out into the storm, wind slapping their faces, snow stinging like glass. Grace pulled her coat tighter while Jack loaded his rifle. His body moved on instinct, the soldier within him waking, every sense sharpening. "Stay behind me," he said. Inside the warehouse, shadows moved fast. Jack could see them through the cracks in the planks, silhouettes pacing, guns glinting under the dim light. He took a breath, exhaled fog, and kicked the door open. The explosion of sound, shouts, gunfire, chaoska. Grace ducked behind a stack of crates as Jack fired to precise shots. Dropping one man, he advanced. Steady, cold, his mind straight line of purpose. From the far end of the room, a scream high, terrified dad. Jack's heart froze. "Ellie." He turned and saw her hands bound. A man gripping her by the arm, gun pressed against her temple. Jake Milner's face was twisted with desperation, blood dried along his cheek from the night before. "Stay back, turn up," he shouted. "I swear to God," but before he could finish, a flash of gold streaked across the room. "Nova, no," Ellie cried. The shepherd launched herself at Milner, he sinking into his arm. The gun went off once, twice, the sound deafening in the confined space. Milner screamed, stumbling backward. Nova didn't let go. She fought like a creature born for this moment, feral, loyal, unstoppable. Jack fired again. Milner fell. The world went silent, except for the wind. Then Ellie's voice, small and trembling. "Nova." The dog staggered, her fur matted with red against the white dusting of snow that blew in from the open doorway. She turned toward Ellie, tail wagging weakly, eyes soft. Ellie ran to her, dropping to her knees, pressing her face into Nova's neck. "No, no. Stay with me, please." Jack lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. He crouched beside them, his hand shaking as he stroked Nova's head. Grace knelt to tears freezing on her lashes. "She saved her," Grace whispered. Jack swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said, voice breaking. "She did." A sound echoed from deeper in the warehouse, the metallic click of a gun being loaded. "Touching," a voice said, deep, cold. Jack turned slowly. Silas Rock stepped out from the shadows, dressed in a long black coat, his revolver gleaming beneath the flickering light. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you, Turner? Should have stayed retired." Jack rose to his feet, eyes hard. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," he said. "Agent Keene, the girl, the dog, all of it ends tonight." Rock smirked. "You think one broken soldier can stop me?" "Not just one," Grace said, raising Milner's dropped pistol. "Two." For a heartbeat, time froze. Then the storm roared through the broken windows, a banshee's cry as lightning lit the sky white. Gunfire erupted. Rock fired first. Jack dove aside, rolled, fired back. Sparks flew from metal, crates splintered. Grace ducked, covering Ellie with her body. Nova tried to stand, growled weakly, still guarding the girl even as his strength faded. Jack moved like he had in the desert years ago, precise, deliberate, every motion born of instinct. He flanked left, using the wind and snow swirling through the open door to mask his position. Rogue circled, shouting curses drowned by the storm. "You think you're saving anyone, Turner? You're just another ghost from a war no one remembers." Jack's voice came calm through the chaos. "Maybe, but ghosts can still finish what the living are too afraid to start." One last shot cracked the air. Rook staggered, eyes wide, then fell to the ground. The gun clattered beside him. For a long moment, no one moved. The blizzard screamed through the doorway, lifting the snow into a spinning white veil. Then Jack lowered his weapon. It was over. He turned back to Ellie, who was still cradling Noah. Grace was pressing her scarf against the wound, whispering prayers through trembling lips. "Come on, girl," Jack said, his voice breaking as he knelt beside her. "You did good. You did real good." Nova blinked once, those amber eyes meeting his, then looked at Ellie one last time. The storm outside quieted, as if even nature paused to listen, and then, slowly, Nova's chest stopped rising. Ellie's sobs were lost in the wind. Jack pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, holding on as if he could shield her from the whole world. Grace rested a hand on his shoulder. Outside, the dawn began to break. The first light of morning spilled across the snow, painting the mountains in silver and gold. Jack looked out through the open door to where the storm had finally passed and whispered, "Rest easy, girl. You brought us home." The wind carried his words away, and for the first time in years, Jack Turner felt something he hadn't known since the war peace. And beneath the old warehouse roof, as the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, a new chapter began, one born not of battle but of love, loyalty, and the kind of courage only a faithful heart could teach. The storm had finally passed. By morning, the snow lay still across the valley, heavy, clean, and silent. The warehouse stood like a scar on the white horizon, smoke curling faintly from its broken roof. The fight was over. But for Jack Turner, it didn't feel like victory, it felt like survival. He watched as the rescue trucks rolled in, red and blue lights flashing against the snow. Grace stood beside him, her coat wrapped tightly, exhaustion softening the sharp lines of her face. Ellie clung to his side, her eyes red but steady. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket, was Nova, weak, breathing shallow, but alive. "Hold on, go," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling but full of faith. "We made it. You're safe now." Jack squeezed her shoulder, glancing at the dog's bandaged side. Grace had done all she could in the field, but Nova's survival still felt like a miracle, the same kind Jack didn't dare believe in anymore until now. From the far end of the warehouse, two medics carried out a man on a stretcher, Agent Keene. His face was pale, bruised, but when he caught sight of Jack, a tired smile cracked through the pain. "You really know how to make an entrance," Keene rasped. Jack gave a faint smile. "Guess we both got lucky." Keene reached out a trembling hand. "No, we got justice. Rock's network, I can give you everything. Every name, every shipment, every cop he owned." Grace looked at Jack, realization dawning. "Including Doyle." Keene nodded, "especially Doyle." Later that day, Cedar Ridge buzzed with more sirens than it had seen in years. News spread fast. The corrupt Sheriff Doyle was in cuffs, escorted from the precinct under the stunned eyes of his deputies. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted. Jack watched from across the street, standing beside Grace. Snowflakes drifted through the cold sunlight. Doyle's eyes met his for a brief, bitter second as he was pushed into the squad car. "You think this changes anything?" Doyle spat. "You'll still be haunted, Turner. Always have been." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The door slammed shut, and the car drove off into the falling snow. Grace exhaled softly beside him. "It's over," she said. Jack looked toward the horizon, the mountains rising under a pale sun. "Maybe," he said quietly, "or maybe it's just beginning." That evening, the town gathered at the small community hall. Someone had lit a fire in the old stone hearth. There were reporters, state agents, and neighbors who hadn't spoken to Jack in years. They called him a hero. But when the mayor offered him a medal, a silver star with his name engraved, Jack shook his head. "I'm no hero," he said simply. "I just did what had to be done." The crowd fell silent. Grace smiled faintly from her seat, eyes glistening with quiet pride. Ellie, sitting in her lap, whispered, "That's what heroes always say." Jack glanced away and almost laughed, the first real laugh in what felt like a lifetime. Later that night, the house was warm again. The fireplace crackled softly, the scent of pine and smoke filling the air. Grace sat by Nova's side, checking her bandages while Elle gently stroked the dog's ear. "She's strong," Grace murmured. "She pulled through." Ellie smiled, her small fingers brushing against Nova's fur. "I knew she would," she whispered, "because I prayed for her. And Mom always said God listens even when the storm's too loud to hear him." Jack stood in the doorway, watching them, his heart heavier and lighter all at once. He walked over and knelt beside Ellie, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You were brave out there," he said softly. "Braver than I ever was." Ellie looked up at him, eyes wide and full of light. "You taught me that, Daddy." For a long moment, Jack couldn't speak. He just pulled her close, holding her tight as Nova's tail thumped weakly against the floorboards once. Twice, Grace smiled. "It looks like someone's saying thank you." Ellie giggled through her tears. "Or you're welcome." Outside, the world had changed. The snow no longer looked like a shroud, but a clean slate, a promise of something new. Jack stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting at his face. He looked up. The clouds had cleared, revealing a sky full of stars. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone beneath them. Grace joined him, wrapping her coat tighter. "Do you ever wonder," she said softly, "why some people make it through the storm and some don't?" Jack thought for a moment, his breath fogging in the night air. "Maybe it's not about who makes it," he said. "Maybe it's about who we become after it's over." She smiled gently. You sound like a preacher, he chuckled, shaking his head. Don't tell Ellie that. Behind them, from inside the house, they could hear the faint murmur of Elle's voice. She was whispering to Nova, her tone calm, steady, full of something beyond her years. God kept his promise, she said softly. He always does. Grace turned to Jack. She's right, you know. Jack looked out over the snow-covered ridge, the quiet world reborn under moonlight, and nodded. Yeah, he said, his voice low, reverent. I believe that now. The wind brushed through the pines, carrying with it the faint scent of cedar and smoke. And as the stars shimmered over Cedar Ridge, Jack Turner finally let himself breathe. The war inside him had ended. The light had come back, and somewhere in the quiet warmth of the house behind him, Nova slept, her chest rising slow but steady, a living reminder that even after the fiercest storm, faith can still bring the dawn. Spring came late to Cedar Ridge. For months, the snow had clung to the mountains like a memory unwilling to fade. But one morning when the sun finally broke through the gray, melting the last sheets of ice, Jack Turner knew the storm was truly over. He stood outside the old lumber warehouse where so much had been lost, and where, somehow, something new had begun. The roof had been repaired, the walls had been painted a soft cedar brown, and above the front door a freshly carved wooden sign waited to be hung. It read, "The shelter for those who had been left behind." Grace came up behind him, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, a few strands of hair blowing in the gentle breeze. "It's beautiful," she said, smiling at the sign. Jack nodded, his eyes soft. "Could have used steadier hands," he said, tracing the carved letters. Grace laughed quietly. "No, it's perfect. Who has heart in every stroke." Behind them, the sound of hammering and chatter filled the air. A handful of volunteers, most of them veterans from the nearby towns, were finishing repairs on the kennels out back. Some worked slow, still carrying the stiffness of old wounds. Others talked quietly, a mix of laughter and silence, the kind that only people who'd seen war could share. And running between them, chasing a ball through the muddy spring grass, was Ellie, her laughter carrying across the yard. Beside her bounded a young German shepherd pup, the smallest of Nova's litter. "Come on, Hope," Ellie called. The pup barked once, sharp and eager, before sprinting back to her, tail wagging furiously. Grace leaned against the post. "Hope," she repeated, smiling. "She picked the name herself, didn't she?" Jack smiled faintly, said it was the only name that felt right. Smart kid. He looked toward the horizon where the snow was slowly retreating, giving way to green. "Yeah," he murmured, "smarter than me, that's for sure." Inside, the shelter smelled of pine, coffee, and wet fur. Half the old warehouse had been turned into a rescue space, rows of clean kennels lined with blankets and toys. The other half had become a meeting area, with worn-out couches, a long table, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Hot coffee, honest talk, no judgment." A man in a worn army jacket sat near the fireplace staring into the flames. His name was Cole, a Marine who hadn't spoken much since his discharge. Ellie approached quietly, Hope trotting beside her. "She likes you," Ellie said, setting a steaming mug of cocoa beside him. Cole blinked, looking down at the pup sniffing his boot. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached out a scarred hand. Hope nudged his palm, warm and alive. Something shifted in his face, small, fragile, but real. Grace, watching from across the room, whispered, "That's the first time he's smiled in weeks." Jack nodded, his throat tightening. "That's why we built this place." By afternoon, the sun had melted much of the yard into patches of mud and wildflowers. The veterans had gathered outside with the dogs, laughing as the pups tumbled over each other in the soft earth. Grace handed out coffee, and Ellie showed off Hope's training sit. "Stay, roll over. She's learning fast," Jack said, washing proudly. Grace smiled. "I've been talking to the mountain rescue team. They're looking for a new search and rescue dog. With her instincts and your training, Hope could make a real difference." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Thinks she's ready for that?" Grace looked at him. "She's your dog, and she was born in a storm." He smiled, the kind of quiet smile that comes after years of fighting, the one that says, maybe peace isn't out there, maybe it's right here. As the day faded, the last of the volunteers headed home. The mountains glowed orange under the setting sun. Grace stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching Ellie and Hope play in the last golden light. "She's changed," Grace said softly. Jack glanced at his daughter, her cheeks flushed with joy, her laughter echoing through the open air. "We all have." Grace turned to him. "You ever think you'd end up here, building a shelter instead of fighting wars?" Jack looked down at the worn hammer in his hand, the faint scars along his knuckles. "No, he said honestly, but maybe this is the only fight that ever mattered. Grace reached over, taking his hand gently. Then let's keep fighting it. He squeezed a hand back, a quiet promise. The sun slipped lower, and Jack lifted the wooden sign into place above the doorway. Grace steadied the ladder, while Ellie stood below, holding Hope in her arms, both watching intently. Ready? Jack asked. Ready, Ellie called. He hammered the final nail. The sound echoed across the valley, 3 solid strikes, and then it was done. He climbed down, standing beside them, looking up at the finished sign. The shelter for those who've been left behind. The evening light caught the lettering, turning it golden. For a moment, everything was still, the wind quiet, the mountains watching. Ellie slipped her small hand into his. It's beautiful, Daddy. Jack looked down at her, smiling softly. It's home, he said. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. Hope barked once, as if in agreement, before running off into the field, chasing the last rays of sun across the melting snow. The air smelled of cedar, warmth, and beginnings. Jack Turner took one long look at the sign, then at the people and creatures gathered around him, the lost, the healing, the hopeful. For the first time in a long, long while, he believed the world could be good again. The storm had ended, the light had returned, and in the quiet valley of Cedar Ridge, the shelter stood not as a monument to what had been lost, but as a promise to what could still be found.